The woman they called Cursed was pregnant with the kingdom's heir, and the king who banished her had no idea he'd just signed his bloodline's death warrant. She carried his child across the frozen border with nothing but cracked boots and a secret that could shatter a throne. He sat on that throne, untouchable, certain strength was the only currency that mattered. He was wrong. Drop your city in the comments, let your pack know you're here, and stay until the very last scene. You won't want to miss what she becomes. The last thing Lyra Vale heard before the gates of Ironfang closed behind her was laughter. Not the cruel, performative kind that powerful men deploy to make a point. This was the loose, careless variety. The laughter of people who had already forgotten you before you were fully gone. Soldiers posted at the northern gatehouse. 2 of them, young, bored, leaning on their spears with the easy posture of men who had never once doubted their place in the world. One of them said something she couldn't make out over the wind. The other one doubled over. Their breath came out in white plumes against the gray morning air, and neither of them looked at her again. She kept walking. The frozen road north stretched ahead of her like a sentence with no ending, pale gravel packed hard by decades of supply wagons that had stopped running years ago when the border territories went dark. On either side, the iron pine forest pressed close, its branches so thick with ice that the trees looked like they'd been cast in glass. The cold had a quality to it she hadn't encountered before. Not the biting cold of an Ironfang winter, which was sharp and fast and left your skin raw. This was something older, patient, the kind of cold that didn't rush. It simply waited for you to stop moving. Lyra did not stop moving. She had allowed herself exactly 3 minutes of stillness after the gate closed. 3 minutes standing in the road with her pack strapped across her shoulders, listening to the distance swallow the sound of the kingdom behind her. 3 minutes to feel the full weight of what had happened in that square. The faces. The silence of people who had watched her be unmade in public and done nothing, because doing something would have cost them more than watching cost her. 3 minutes to acknowledge the nausea that had been building since dawn, which she knew had nothing to do with the cold and everything to do with the small life she was carrying that no one in that square had known about except her. Then she had started walking. Because the alternative was to stop, and stopping was dying, and she was not done yet. She hadn't decided what she was not done with. She only knew the sentence wasn't finished. 3 weeks earlier, the throne room of the Ironfang Citadel had smelled like blood and frankincense, the particular combination that preceded formal judgment. Lyra had known what was coming before she crossed the threshold. You could read a room's intention from the doorway if you'd spent enough years learning how rooms worked. She had spent her entire life in the shadow of this citadel, and she had become fluent in its moods the way other healers became fluent in fever or wound rot. The frankincense meant ceremony. The blood smell meant something, or someone, had already been sacrificed to the argument. The court was arranged in a horseshoe around the central dais. 60-odd wolves in their finest, standing with the careful stillness of people performing composure. Lord Commander Aldrich near the front, his face arranged in practiced neutrality. Lady Marin of House Greyfall, jaw set, eyes down. Elder Serath, ancient and dry-eyed, watching Lyra enter with the expression of a man watching water run downhill. Inevitable, unremarkable. And at the center of it all, on the raised throne carved from black ironwood, Kyle Draven, Alpha King of Ironfang. 29 years old and built like the kingdom itself, massive, cold-angled, made of hard lines and the particular discipline that comes from being raised to believe that weakness is not a human quality but a choice. His wolf form stood 7 feet at the shoulder, and his human form wasn't much smaller. He had a scar that ran from his left cheekbone to his jaw, earned in the border wars at 18, and he wore it the way powerful men wear all their damage, as evidence. He was looking at Lyra when she walked in, and the look was not unkind in any identifiable way. It was simply nothing, a technical appraisal. The way you might look at a tool that had proven unreliable before deciding what to do with it. She had shared his bed for 4 months. She had healed 3 of his best warriors after the autumn ambush, sitting awake for 19 straight hours with her hands in their wounds until their bodies remembered how to repair themselves. She had stood in this court 100 times as the palace healer, the quiet Omega who could not fully shift, the one they tolerated because her gift was useful even if her blood was inconvenient. And he was looking at her like she was a tool. Lyra Vale, his voice carried without effort. It always had. Not loud, just inexorable. The kind of voice that didn't need to climb above the ambient sound because the ambient sound always fell quiet first. Approach. She approached. Her boots were steady on the stone. She kept her chin level. You know why you're here. I've been told it concerns the plague assessments, she said. Her voice was even. She had been practicing even for 3 days, ever since she heard the whispers start moving through the servant corridors. My lord believes my findings were inaccurate. My lord believes your findings were deliberate. He leaned forward slightly. Not standing, he didn't need to stand. The bloodline illness isn't random, Lyra. It's targeted. Noble-born wolves, full-blood shifters. The weakest cases are Omegas. Do you understand what that pattern implies? It implies the illness has a preference for mature alpha strain genetic markers, she said, which would suggest a pathogen that evolved specifically to target the dominant gene, which means someone with knowledge of our bloodlines engineered it. The word landed like a stone in water. The ripples were visible even in the stillness of the court. She looked at him for a moment before she answered. She wanted to make sure she had read the room correctly, that she wasn't misreading this as anything other than what it was. She wasn't. He believed what he was saying, or he had decided to believe it because it was useful. The distinction, she was beginning to understand, didn't matter. You're accusing me. I'm presenting the court with findings, he said, and there was something almost regretful in his tone that she might have believed if she hadn't known him well enough to recognize the particular quality of his performance. He was not regretful. He was settled. He had made the decision before she walked in. Your blood is Omega strain. You would be largely immune to the pathogen's effects. You were present in the infirmary with every major case in the past 6 weeks. You have intimate knowledge of noble bloodline genetics. And, he paused just a beat, your loyalty to this pack has never been beyond question. You were born outside the walls. You were brought in by a healer who is now dead. We have only your word for what you are. The court was very quiet. Lyra's hands, clasped in front of her, were steady. She focused on that steadiness, on the feeling of her own feet against the floor. I have healed 43 members of this court over the past 3 years, she said, including you, including Lord Commander Aldrich, whose life I held in my hands for 6 hours after the Grey Peak ambush. You have never been accused before, Kael said. That isn't the same as innocence. He sat back. His expression had not changed. By the authority of the Alpha Throne, I am finding sufficient cause to invoke exile protocol. You are to be escorted to the northern border and released beyond the Iron Fang territory line before nightfall. The frankincense was very strong. The blood smell was older. She understood now it was from the bound wolf they'd executed that morning for a different violation, someone she hadn't known, whose death had been used to warm up the room's capacity for consequence. She looked at him for 3 full seconds before she spoke. You know I didn't do this. Kael Draven met her eyes. His didn't waver. Take her out, he said to the guards. The escort had been 4 soldiers, because even in public humiliation the court maintained a certain protocol about not sending people into the northern wildlands alone. They hadn't spoken to her during the ride to the gate. One of them, a young wolf named Davin, who had brought her broth when she sat up healing his commanding officer, and never forgotten it, had slipped a second blanket into her pack when he thought the others weren't looking. His eyes hadn't met hers. She hadn't said anything. She had folded the blanket in and kept moving, because what was there to say that would matter? At the gate, Elder Serath had been waiting. She hadn't expected that. He was the oldest member of the Royal Council, 80 years into his wolf life and still sharp as new iron, though he moved like a man conserving fuel. He had watched her enter the throne room with that unremarkable expression. She had assumed he supported the accusation. Most of the council had. He had pulled her aside out of the guards' earshot while they went through the formality of confirming her exile documents. Listen carefully, he said. His voice was so quiet she felt it more than heard it. Don't listen to me sympathetically. Make your face bored. Good. She made her face bored. Her heart was hitting the back of her sternum in a slow, heavy rhythm. What I am about to tell you is not something I can tell you here, he said. What I will tell you is this. The blood you carry is older than you know. Don't let anyone who comes looking for you take the child. Not anyone. She kept her face bored. Inside, something had gone very quiet and very still, the way a forest goes quiet before a storm that only the oldest animals can smell coming. You know, she said, just barely. I have always known, he said, which is why I said nothing at the trial, because if the wrong people understood what you're carrying, exile would not have been the sentence. He stepped back, resuming the distance of an elder watching routine bureaucratic procedure. Move fast. Move north. Don't stop near any pack territory until you're past the Threnfell River. Then he had gone back to standing with the others, and the gates had opened and she had walked through, and the soldiers behind her had laughed at something she couldn't hear. Guts. By midday, the road had become a suggestion. The maintained gravel gave way to packed earth, then to ground that was simply frozen ground with no particular ambition of being a road at all. The iron pines thinned out and were replaced by something older and darker, gray-barked trees she didn't have names for, their branches bare in a way that seemed less like winter and more like the trees had decided to stop participating. The light was thin and horizontal even at noon, the sun barely clearing the tree line before beginning its early retreat. Lyra walked with her pack arranged to carry weight off her lower back, a habit she'd developed 2 weeks ago when the nausea had given way to a new discomfort, a low, persistent pressure that told her the child was already asserting itself. She was perhaps 9 or 10 weeks in. Her own healing knowledge was working against her because she understood exactly what was happening inside her body, and understanding it made it more, rather than less, surreal. A cluster of cells becoming a system developing the first crude architecture of what would eventually be a spine, a pulse, a set of lungs that would one day breathe the same cold air she was breathing now. She had not told Kael. She had considered it. In the weeks after she had confirmed the pregnancy, she had run the scenario forward in every direction she could think of. In most of them, telling him changed nothing about the trajectory of the accusation, which had been building since before she got pregnant, she now understood, since the first cases of the plague and the whisper campaigns that had started in the court. In some of them, telling him made things considerably worse. A pregnant Omega carrying a potential royal heir was a political resource, not a person. She had watched how the court treated political resources. She had not told him. Now, walking north through the edge of the known world, she turned the decision over in her hands the way you turn a wound to check all its angles. She did not know if she had made the right choice. She knew she had made a choice, and that it was hers, and that in a life that had never offered her much ownership over her own circumstances, that distinction felt like something close to solid ground. The first night, she made camp in a hollow between 2 of the gray-barked trees, gathering enough deadfall to build a fire that was more heat than light. She ate from her pack, dried meat, hard cheese, a handful of grain she had ground to paste and wrapped in cloth, and then sat with her back against the bark and her hands wrapped around her knees and let herself be frightened for exactly as long as it took the fire to burn down to coals. She was frightened for about an hour. Then she rebuilt the fire and took out the small journal she'd carried for 3 years, which was mostly filled with healer's notes and bloodwork observations and the occasional half-formed thought she hadn't had time to finish during court hours. She turned to a blank page. She wrote a single line, not for anyone who might read it someday, but for herself, as a kind of contract. I am not finished. She closed the journal. She slept in 2-hour intervals, waking each time to tend the fire and listen to the dark. Nothing came. By dawn, she was moving again. The Threnfell River was 12 days north, by her estimate. She had studied the territorial maps extensively during her years in the palace infirmary, not because she had planned to flee, but because she was the kind of person who studied things, who could not let a gap in her knowledge go unfilled, who had spent her whole life building competence as a substitute for the safety she'd never been given. The maps had told her the northern wildlands were contested. 3 rival wolf clans claimed different sections, none of them allied with Ironfang, all of them hostile to kingdom wolves on principle. She would need to move through their territories without being identified. Her wolf form was limited. She had always shifted partially. Fur came and went, her senses sharpened, her healing ability expanded. But she had never completed the full transition that every other wolf she'd known had crossed before their first decade. The court had called this weakness. The court had been wrong, but not in the way she'd have chosen. What she could do was move quietly, read terrain, and heal. Her body ran warmer than any human's and cooler than a full-shift wolf's, a narrow range that made her harder to track by heat signature. Her omega-strain blood, which Kael had cited as evidence of her marginality, was in fact something else entirely. Something Elder Serath's final words were still unfolding inside her like a letter she was reading for the first time. The blood you carry is older than you know. She filed it. She would have time to understand it later. Right now she needed to get past the Threnfell. On the fourth day, she encountered the first sign that someone was using the northern road. Tracks in a frozen mud patch, boot prints, 4 sets, irregular spacing suggesting a group that wasn't moving in formation. Hunters, maybe, or scouts from one of the northern clans testing the southern edge of their territory. She stepped around the tracks and picked up her pace. By afternoon, the feeling of being watched had become a specific sensation rather than a general one, directional, persistent, originating somewhere in the dark tree line to her east. She kept her face forward and her breathing steady. If she was being scouted, running would confirm she was prey. Walking, she was simply a traveler, possibly annoying, possibly dangerous. Neither quality was worth an interdiction. The sensation didn't leave. At dusk, when she stopped to assess the ground for a campsite, a voice came out of the tree line. "Stop where you are." She stopped. Her hands were at her sides. She did not reach for the knife at her hip, because reaching for a knife when outnumbered was the kind of gesture that ended conversations before they started. 3 of them emerged from the trees. 2 men, 1 woman, all in the patched leathers of northern clan wolves who'd been living rough. The woman was in front, tall, wide-shouldered, with close-cropped hair, and the kind of face that had been outdoors in hard weather for a long time. Her nose had been broken and healed badly, canted slightly left. Her eyes moved across Lyra in a professional sweep. "Kingdom Wolf," she said. Not a question. "Ironfang Exile," Lyra said. "There's a difference." "Not a big one from where I'm standing." "Then you're standing in a place that's keeping you from making a useful distinction." Lyra met the woman's eyes. "I'm not carrying dispatches or kingdom weapons. I have 60 yards of rope, 3 days of food, medical supplies, and a working knowledge of infection treatment that I will happily trade for a fire and a direction." The woman considered her for a long moment. Her 2 companions shifted. The one on the left was young, barely an adult, his wolf sense written in the way he held his shoulders, proud and anxious in equal measure. The one on the right was older, gray at the temples, watching Lyra with an expression she recognized, a healer's expression, methodical, diagnosing. "You're a healer," he said. "Yes." "Kingdom healer coming north alone in cold season," the woman said. "Either you're stupid or you're running from something bad." "The second one," Lyra said. A beat. The woman's broken-nosed face was readable if you knew what to look for. She was calculating odds, not outcomes. Whether Lyra was useful, not whether she was trustworthy. Trust was a long game, and they were in a short one. "Venna," the older man said quietly. "I see it, Court." She exhaled. Made a decision. "You follow exactly 1 step behind me. You don't touch anything in camp without asking, and if I decide you're trouble, I will put you in the ground before you finish your next sentence. We clear?" "Clear," Lyra said. "Untikin." The northern camp was 3 days deeper into the wildlands, a semi-permanent arrangement of shelters built into a rock formation that a quick scan told her had been occupied and abandoned and reoccupied in cycles for decades. 12 people lived here, a mix of ages, all of them carrying the patched and repaired quality of people who had been improvising for a long time. There were 2 children, young enough that their wolf sense was still the diffuse, unformed kind that showed up as intuition rather than instinct. Both of them looked at Lyra when she arrived the way children look at strangers they haven't yet been told to distrust. She earned her place quickly. A man named Oren had a wound infection in his left forearm that had been treated inadequately for 2 weeks. She could smell it before she saw it, the specific sourness of aggressive bacteria in a closed space. She cleaned it, repackaged it with a poultice from her medical kit, and showed him the correct protocol for the next 10 days, in terms that assumed he was intelligent and capable, because he was. He didn't say thank you. He said, "You've done this before." "I've done it a few hundred times," she said. "How'd you end up out here?" She considered her answer for exactly as long as she'd needed to before answering Kael in the throne room. The principle was the same. Give them what they can handle knowing, not more, not less. "I was the court healer," she said. "When the plague started, the king needed someone to blame for it." Oren looked at his freshly dressed wound, and he picked the one person who could have helped him fix it. "Yes." He shook his head, a slow, tired shake, the kind that doesn't bother with surprise anymore. "That sounds about right for kingdom politics." Venna fed her that night, which was not warmth exactly, but was function, which in Lyra's experience was more reliable than warmth and often more valuable. They didn't ask many questions. She didn't offer much. She ate. She helped the older man court organize their medical stores with the kind of systematic efficiency that made him raise his eyebrows. And she slept on the floor of the main shelter with everyone else, and woke in the dark hours to the sound of the young wolves breathing around her and the steady particular gravity of the life she was carrying. She was 6 weeks out from Ironfang when the sickness in the camp found her. It came in quietly, the way serious things always do. Not with the fanfare of crisis, but as a gradual dimming. 3 of the adults developed fevers, then 2 of the children. Lyra sat up through the first night and then the second, moving between patients with the focused economy of someone who knows how to ration themselves across a long stretch. She could feel her own body registering the demand. The pregnancy amplified her fatigue in ways she was still learning to read. Her healing ability pulling harder on reserves that were feeding 2 lives now instead of 1. She did not sleep much. She ate what they brought her without registering it. She kept the fevers down and the airways clear and watched for the particular symptom pattern that would tell her whether this was ordinary illness or something she'd seen before. On the 3rd day, she saw it. The older of the 2 children, a girl, 7 years old, her wolf sense already developing into something sharper than average, stopped responding to the fever treatments. Her temperature had been dropping steadily, which should have been improvement. Instead, her aura went flat, in the way Lyra had only seen once before, in the palace infirmary, in a 20-year-old warrior from House Stonefall who had been one of the first cases of the bloodline plague. Her wolf ability was dying. Lyra held the girl's wrist and felt it, the specific quality of a diminishing wolf strain, the genetic line thinning at the edges like a candle going down. She had documented this pattern in 16 patients at Ironfang. She had never been able to reverse it. No one had. Her hands were doing what they always did when something was this bad, going very still, because stillness meant precision, and precision was the only variable she had any control over. "What is it?" Venna said from the doorway. Not a question. She had been watching Lyra's face, and the question was already answered. "She needs something I don't have in this kit," Lyra said. "I need silver spruce bark extract, not the processed kind, raw bark, and I need fresh marrow from a dominant strain wolf. Adult, minimum 10 years into their shift." Venna was quiet for a moment. "Why the dominant strain?" "Because whatever this is, it's attacking the recessive markers first. The dominant strain marrow might give her immune system a template to rebuild from." She paused. "I've never tried it. I'm telling you what the logic suggests, not what I know." "So you're guessing." "I'm hypothesizing with the best available data." Lyra met her eyes. "The alternative is doing nothing." Venna looked at the child for a long time. The girl's breathing was shallow but steady. Her face in sleep was very young. "I'll send Court for the bark," Venna said. "The marrow." She stopped, looked at Lyra differently. "You carry dominant strain. I can smell it even through the Omega signature." "What you are is complicated, healer." Lyra's jaw tightened. "Yes. You'd have to give your own marrow." "I know. In your condition." Venna's eyes had dropped briefly to Lyra's midsection and come back up. A healer's eyes, in the end, or a wolf's. Both could smell what was there. That's not a small ask. No, Lyra agreed. But she's 7 years old. Venna held her gaze for a long moment, and then something in the woman's expression shifted. Not softened exactly, but repositioned, like a wall that doesn't come down but stops being a wall and becomes, briefly, a door. Court will get the bark, she said. Tell me what I need to do. Dichet. The procedure took 4 hours and left Lyra shaking so badly she had to be held upright by Court and the young wolf whose name she'd learned was Pell. She had done the extractions and the application herself, talking Venna through each step, her hand steadier than her body had any right to produce. When it was done and the girl's aura began the slow, uncertain process of rebuilding, not guaranteed, not confirmed, but present, which was more than it had been, Lyra allowed herself to be lowered to a bedroll and did not argue about resting. She lay on her back and watched the shelter ceiling and felt the child inside her, still present, still itself, and thought about what it meant to give something when you had very little left. Not noble, not heroic, just arithmetic. The girl had decades of life ahead of her. The marrow would replenish. The calculation was obvious, but she was aware, lying there with the cold pressing through the walls and the sounds of the camp settling around her, that she had made the calculation without hesitation, and that this was perhaps the most honest thing she knew about herself, that she could not watch someone lose what they were and do nothing, even when the cost was high, even when the person who had destroyed her own life had built his entire throne on the premise that people like her were expendable. She thought about Kael Draven's eyes in the throne room, the nothing in them. She thought about the child she was carrying, who did not know yet what world it was being born into. I am not finished, she had written. She closed her eyes. The fire crackled. The girl's breathing, from the other side of the shelter, steadied. Lyra slept. She woke to Venna's hand on her shoulder and a quality of light through the shelter gaps that told her she'd slept through the night and most of the following morning. She's stable, Venna said. Fever broke 2 hours ago. Aura's coming back. A pause. Slowly, but back. Lyra sat up. Her body was a catalog of complaints, but they were all manageable complaints, the kind that meant cost rather than damage. She checked her own pulse, ran a quick internal assessment the way she did every morning now. The treatment worked, she said. Looks like. Venna sat back on her heels, watching her with an expression Lyra was beginning to read. Direct, evaluative, the particular attention of someone who respects capability more than affiliation. You should know there's a man asking about you. Lyra's hand stopped. Northern trader came through at dawn, Venna said. Word moving down from the Threnfell settlements. Says there's a kingdom reward out for information on a female healer, Omega strain, exiled 6 weeks ago. Her eyes hadn't moved from Lyra's face. Significant reward, the kind that makes people reconsider their loyalties. The shelter felt smaller. What did you tell the trader? Lyra said. Nothing yet. Venna's voice was level. But he's still here, sharing our fire, and I have 12 people depending on this camp staying off the kingdom's map. She paused. I need to know what I'm protecting, not the story. I've heard the story, exile, plague accusation, standard kingdom politics. I need to know what they're actually looking for. Lyra looked at her for a long moment. Outside, she could hear voices around the fire, the clatter of morning routine, Pell laughing at something Court said. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a life that 12 people had built in a hard place and were trying to keep. She made the decision the same way she'd made the other one. Quickly, clearly, without sentimentality about it. She took Venna's hand and placed it against her abdomen. Not her belly. Lower, where the life was. Venna went very still. Her wolf sense would read it. Would read the aura within the aura, the small but unmistakable genetic signature of a child whose dominant strain was not Omega and not minor Alpha. Was something older, something the northern wolves would recognize the way they recognize thunderstorms, not by knowing the science, but by feeling the pressure drop. Venna pulled her hand back slowly. The king doesn't know, Lyra said. No, Venna said, very quiet. He wouldn't be sending traitors if he did. He'd be coming himself. Her expression was unreadable for a long moment. Then something moved across her face, not fear, not quite, but its well-organized cousin. "Do you know what this child is?" "Not completely," Lyra said. "I know what it could be. I know what certain people at the court believed it would be before they arranged to get rid of me before anyone could confirm it." Venna was quiet. "The traitor," Lyra said. "How long before he moves on?" "He said tonight. He'll carry word north or south depending on who pays more." Venna stood, looked down at Lyra with the expression she'd worn at the tree line that first night, calculating odds, not outcomes. "I have 12 people. I know. If the kingdom comes here looking for you, we burn everything we've built here. I know. So I need you to tell me," Venna said, "whether protecting you is worth that cost. And I need you to be honest with me, not diplomatic." Lyra met her eyes. She thought about Elder Sarath's hand on her arm and the words he'd measured out like something precious. She thought about the girl's aura rebuilding, slow and certain, on the other side of the shelter wall. She thought about what she was carrying and what it meant and what the men who had exiled her were going to understand eventually when the kingdom began to fall apart around them. "The child I'm carrying," she said, "is the last pureblood heir of the Alpha line. There are people in the Iron Fang court who know this and arranged my exile to prevent anyone else from knowing. When the kingdom starts losing its bloodlines, and it will, the plague I documented is only beginning, they will come looking. And when they come, it won't be traitors. It will be armies." Venna was very still. "What I can offer you," Lyra said, "is the same thing I offered you in that tree line. Not safety, not a future that doesn't involve hard choices. Just someone who will not waste what you spend protecting her." She paused. "And a child who might, someday, be worth having on your side rather than against you." The fire crackled outside. The girl breathed steadily on the other side of the wall. Venna looked at her for a very long moment, and then she said quietly, almost to herself, 12 people. "I know," Lyra said. "Get up," Venna said. "We're moving camp before the traitor leaves." Achant. They moved, and they kept moving. And 3 weeks later, past the Threnfell River and into territory that no Iron Fang soldier had crossed in 40 years, Lyra met the man named Ronan Vex. She would have recognized him as dangerous from across a field. Not from his size, though he was substantial, or from the scarring on his hands, or from the way every wolf in his company deferred to him without being asked to. She would have recognized him from the way he looked at her when Venna introduced them. Not with the evaluating blankness of men who see a woman and see a category, but with the specific attention of someone who was reading everything at once: her posture, her pack weight, her gait, the fact that she was still walking straight after nearly 2 months of frozen wilderness. "You're the kingdom healer," he said. "I was," she said. "You saved Venna's girl." "The girl saved herself. I gave her the materials." He considered this for a moment, not disagreeing but storing it, the way you store something you aren't sure you understand yet but will need to later. "You're welcome here," he said, "for as long as you need." She looked at him carefully, looked at the camp around them, large, well-organized, with the particular efficiency of a place that had been built by someone who understood that survival wasn't glamorous and didn't pretend otherwise. Looked at the wolves moving through it with the purposeful ease of people who trusted their leadership enough to not be constantly watching their own backs. She thought about what it had cost her to trust the last leader she'd stood in front of. "Why?" she said. He didn't look offended. He looked like he'd expected the question. "Because Venna says you're worth it," he said. "And Venna is the worst judge of useless people I've ever known." Something that had been very tight in Lyra's chest for 2 months, for longer than 2 months, for perhaps as long as she could remember, Shema loosened, fractionally, enough to register. "I'll need a space to work," she said. "A proper infirmary, supplies. I can inventory what you have and tell you what we're missing." "Done," he said. "And I need your word," she said, "that what I carry doesn't leave this territory without my consent. No word south. No word to Kingdom Scouts or Northern Clan traders or anyone who moves between territories." He looked at her for a long moment. looked at her the way she'd only been looked at a handful of times. Not at what she was, but at what she knew, and what she carried, and what she might become, given the right ground to stand on. "You have my word," Ronan Vex said. Lyra Vale nodded, and for the first time in 2 months, she stopped walking. 4 months later, on the coldest night the Northern Territories had recorded in a generation, she brought her son into the world in a cabin that smelled of pine resin and wood smoke. Ronan was outside the door. Venna was inside, holding Lyra's hand with the grip of someone who had been through hard things and was not frightened of them. Court managed the practical elements with the quiet competence Lyra had come to rely on. She did not scream. She breathed. She worked with her body the way she'd worked with every crisis in every infirmary she'd ever stood in. Methodically, with full presence, not fighting what was happening, but moving through it with as much precision as the circumstances allowed. And then he was there. She held him in the first minutes and understood something she had not had the language for before, that there were ways of knowing a person that had nothing to do with time. He was 8 pounds of new life, an absolute specific gravity, and she looked at his face and recognized him the way you recognize something that has always been true and that you are only now seeing. The wolf aura came before he cried. It moved through the cabin like a pressure change, like the moment before lightning. Not frightening exactly, but enormous, the kind of presence that rewrites a room's understanding of its own scale. Venna's breath caught audibly. Court went very still. Through the cabin wall, Lyra heard Ronan say something quietly to the wolves with him, and she heard the quality of their silence shift. Not fear, but the specific weight of people who have just understood that they are standing close to something important. Her son opened his eyes. They were gray. Not the pale gray of an overcast sky, but the deep gray of ironstone in deep water, saturated with something that had no name in any language she knew. He looked at her with the focused attention of a being that had been waiting. "Hello," she said. Very quiet. "I know you." Outside, in the dark of the Northern Territory, the wolves were silent. And 600 miles south, in the Iron Fang Citadel, in the infirmary records that had been sealed by order of the Royal Council since the plague began, a file with Lyra Vale's name on it was pulled from a locked cabinet by a man with Elder Serath's key, and the name on the file next to hers was not the name of an Omega. It was the name of the Alpha bloodline, and the royal physician who pulled it looked at what it contained and understood, finally, what had been hidden and why. He looked at it for a long time, then he went to find the king. The royal physician's name was Aldrich Fenn, and he had been lying to the king for 11 years. Not in the dramatic way of men who enjoy their own deception. Fenn was not that kind of man. He was a precise, dry-eyed pragmatist who had inherited the palace infirmary from his predecessor and the sealed file from Elder Serath, and who had understood from the moment he read it that the information inside was the kind that got people killed in proportion to how many people knew it. So he had kept it locked. He had kept it quiet. He had done his job and maintained his silence and told himself, on the nights when the silence felt heavier than usual, that protecting dangerous knowledge was a form of service. He had been wrong. He understood that now, standing in the corridor outside the king's private study, with the file under his arm and the full weight of what he'd allowed to happen pressing down through every floor of the citadel beneath his feet. He knocked. The king's voice came through the door. "Enter." Cale Draven was at his desk when Fenn came in, not sitting at it, but standing behind it with both hands flat on the surface, staring at a map that had been weighted open at its corners with 4 iron pieces. The map showed the kingdom's bloodline territories, the noble houses, the minor clan affiliations, the outer reaches. 17 locations had been marked in red ink since the plague assessments began. 3 more had been added in the past week. He looked up when Fenn entered. His expression didn't change, but his eyes did. They sharpened in the way that meant his attention had rearranged itself around a new priority. "You have something," he said. "Yes." "Sit down." "I'll stand," Fenn said. And then, before the king could respond to that, "What I'm about to tell you cannot be undone by your reaction to it. I need you to hear the complete information before you speak. I'm asking because the decisions you make in the next 5 minutes will determine whether this kingdom survives what's coming, and I would rather not watch you make them badly. Kael looked at him for a long moment. The thing about the king, Fen had always thought, was that he was genuinely intelligent beneath the performance of dominance. He simply hadn't been given any reason to use that intelligence in directions that didn't involve the consolidation of power. Right now, though, something in his posture registered the gravity in Fen's voice and responded to it in kind. He straightened, folded his hands. "Talk," he said. Fen opened the file on the desk. Pas. It took 12 minutes to walk him through it. The bloodline records, the genetic lineage documentation that Serath had compiled over 40 years of careful research, the specific notation in Serath's cramped, precise handwriting of what happened when omega-strain blood carrying the recessive pureblood gene encountered dominant alpha-strain blood from the founding line. The founding line, which had been believed extinct for 3 generations. Which had not been extinct. Which had been running quiet in the female omega-strain descendants of a house that the court had dismissed as irrelevant decades before Kael was born. Which had been running in Lyra Vale's blood. Kael did not speak during the 12 minutes. His hands stayed folded. His breathing stayed even. The only change Fen could track was in his eyes. They moved across the documents with a focus that was almost painful to watch, the way a man looks when he is reading something that is rewriting every decision he has made in the past year, and he is aware of this rewriting in real time and cannot stop it. When Fen stopped talking, the silence lasted long enough that the fire in the grate had shifted audibly before Kael spoke. "She was pregnant," he said. "The timing of her blood work and the documentation in her personal healer's file, yes. She was already carrying when she was exiled." Another silence. "She knew," Kael said. "What she was carrying, she knew, and she didn't tell me." "She knew some of it," Fen said carefully. "Serath told her at the gate. I found his notation in his personal records this morning. He told her the blood was important. He didn't tell her the full scope. I don't think he had time." "She knew enough." Kael's voice was very flat. Not angry, or rather, not only angry because anger was a simple thing, and what was moving through his expression was not simple. "She walked out of those gates with the last pureblood heir, and she said nothing." "My lord," Fen's voice was steady. "She was being exiled on a false accusation. She had no reason to believe that information would protect her, rather than make things considerably worse. And frankly," he paused, "made the decision. Frankly, she was right." Kael looked at him. "If she had told you at the gate," Fen said, "what would you have done?" The question sat in the room. Kael did not answer it. He didn't need to. They both understood what the answer was and what it meant, and the only reason Fen was still standing upright and employed was that Kael was, in this moment, too focused on the larger problem to redirect the anger. "How long has the child been alive?" Kael said. Based on the timeline, Fen did the calculation he'd already done 3 times. 4 months, perhaps 5. And the plague. The plague will take the last of the noble house bloodlines within 2 years at its current rate. The pureblood heir is the only genetic line that carries the restoration marker, the specific gene complex that can rebuild the dominant strain across the affected bloodlines. Without the child, the kingdom loses its alpha lineage within a generation. Without the alpha lineage, the pack structure collapses, Kael said, and every rival clan on the continent moves in. Yes, Kael looked at the map, at the 17 red marks. His hands unfolded and refold on the desk surface, a small, contained movement that Fen had learned to read as the equivalent of a controlled explosion. "Where is she?" he said. "North, past the Threnfell, based on the trader reports coming in from the border settlements, traveling with a northern clan group, possibly under Ronan Vex's protection. His territory starts 3 days past the river." Vex. The name landed differently. Kael's jaw set. "She's with Vex." "It appears so. He'll know what the child is. His clan has old bloodline knowledge. They don't share it with kingdom wolves, but they carry it. The moment that child's aura registered, he would have understood." "Yes," Fen said. which means he also understands the strategic value of what he's protecting. Kale looked at the map for another long moment. Then he moved around the desk, and Fen stepped back to let him pass, and the king stood at the window looking out at the pre-dawn gray of the courtyard below. His reflection in the cold glass was dark and still. "If I send an army north," he said, "Vex fights back, and the child dies in the conflict." "Almost certainly." "If I send scouts, Vex burns them before they get close enough to report." "Probably." "So I go myself." Ben said nothing, which was, in this case, the same as saying yes. "Alone," Kael said. "Not entirely alone, but—" Ben chose his words with the care of a man diffusing something. The fewer kingdom wolves cross into Vex's territory, the less it looks like a military incursion, and the more it looks like a man who made a mistake trying to correct it. "Is that what this is?" The question was quiet, quieter than anything Kael had said in the past 12 minutes, which made it louder in the ways that mattered. Ben looked at the king's reflection in the window, at the scar running down his jaw, at the set of his shoulders, which were carrying something now that they hadn't been carrying when Fen walked in. "What it is," Fen said carefully, "is a man who exiled the wrong person for the wrong reasons and needs to go get her back before the consequences of that decision become permanent." He paused. "What it becomes after that depends on choices I can't make for you." Kael turned from the window. His face had the quality it got before a decision was fully made, present, dangerous, stripped of the performing layer that usually covered everything. "Get Serath," he said, "and Aldrich, not the full council, those three. An hour." "Yes, my lord." "And Fen." Kael's voice stopped him at the door. "The elders who sealed this file. The ones who knew what Lyra was and said nothing during the trial." Fen turned. "Find out," Kael said, "how many of them knew." Elder Serath was not surprised when they came for him. He was 80 years old and had been waiting for this particular morning with the patient resignation of someone who has made a long bet and is finally watching it pay out in the way they feared rather than the way they'd hoped. He was dressed when Fen's man arrived. He had tea made. He walked into the council chamber and sat across from Kael Draven and did not perform contrition. That was the first thing Kael registered. The old man looked at him the way you look at someone you've been watching for a long time, assessing accumulated evidence, and what was in his eyes was not fear. "You knew," Kael said, "the entire trial. You knew what she was carrying, and you said nothing." "Yes," Serath said. "Explain why I shouldn't have you removed from this council before I leave this room. Because I'm the only person in this citadel who knows every detail of the bloodline documentation, and if you exile or execute me before you find Lyra Vale, you will be walking into Ronan Vex's territory blind." Serath set his tea down. "I told her at the gate. I told her to run. I told her to protect the child. I did this because the alternative, telling the court, letting the information become political currency before anyone understood what it meant, would have gotten her killed and the child with her." His eyes were steady. "I was protecting the bloodline, which is, technically, my function. By letting me exile her. By letting you make a mistake that was already in motion and couldn't be stopped," Serath said, "rather than making a larger one that couldn't be survived. Yes." The chamber was very quiet. Lord Commander Aldrich, standing to Kael's left, had the expression of a man who has recently realized he was in a much larger story than he thought. "The plague," Kael said. "Did you know it was targeted?" "I suspected. The specificity of the affected bloodlines, yes. Someone understood our genetic architecture well enough to design something that would work slowly and selectively." Serath paused. "Not Lyra. She was documenting it. If she'd been responsible, she wouldn't have kept records that clearly showed the progression." "Then who?" Serath's expression shifted. Something moved behind his eyes, so not hesitation exactly, but the quality of a man releasing a weight he's been holding for a long time. "That," he said, "is what I've spent 11 years trying to confirm, and I believe I now have enough." He reached into his coat and placed a second file on the table. Kael looked at it, looked at Serath, reached for it. Yeah. The name on the inside cover was not a name Cale had expected. He read the file in silence while the chamber waited. Aldrich's breathing was audible. Serath's tea cooled. Somewhere in the citadel walls, the early morning sounds of the palace starting its day filtered through the stone. When Kyle set the file down, his expression was the one Fen would later describe to his wife as the face of a man who has just counted the cost of something and found it considerably higher than he budgeted for. "How long?" he said. "The cultivation of the plague agent. At least 8 years," Serath said. "The political maneuvering that put Lyra in a position where she could be credibly accused, closer to 4. They needed her gone before she gave birth." Cale's voice was flat, working through it. Because once the child existed and its aura registered, the bloodline question would be undeniable. They couldn't control that. So they removed her while the evidence was still concealable, Serath said. "Yes. And the accusation, did they didn't manufacture it entirely. They cultivated the conditions that made it plausible and then waited for you to make it yourself." Serath's voice was without cruelty, but it was also without softness. "Which you did." The silence after that had a specific texture. Cale was sitting very still, and the stillness wasn't the controlled variety he usually performed. It was the kind that comes after a structural impact, when the body is checking itself for damage before deciding whether to stand. He had been moved like a piece on a board, carefully, over years, by people who understood his pride better than he did and had used it with precision. Lyra hadn't engineered the plague. She had documented it. She had been in the infirmary with every case because she was the healer, because she was doing her job, because she was the only one qualified to track what was happening. And he had taken that proximity and built an accusation from it because the accusation had been pre-built for him, the pieces arranged by patient hands, and he had walked into it with the certainty of a man who had never seriously questioned whether his instincts could be weaponized against him. He stood. "Get my travel kit," he said to Aldrich. 3 wolves, not kingdom marked, northern leathers, no crests. We leave at noon." "My lord." "The council is suspended until I return. Serath will manage the plague documentation and the bloodline records. No information about the heir leaves this room." He picked up the second file. "And when I get back, we are going to have a very specific conversation about the names on this list." "The border crossing," Aldrich said. "Vex has wolves patrolling the Threnfell." "I know." Cale was already moving toward the door. "I'm not crossing as the king." "Then as what?" He stopped with his hand on the door, didn't turn back. "As a man who made a mistake," he said, "and needs to find out whether it can be corrected." He reached the Threnfell on the 3rd day. The river was half frozen, its center current still moving black and fast beneath a crust of shelf ice that was passable in the early morning hours before the temperature climbed. Cale crossed it on foot with his 3 wolves strung out behind him at intervals, which was not the posture of an invading force, but was also not the posture of a man who was unprepared for things to go badly. The northern forest received them without comment. He had been in hostile territory before, had crossed 3 sets of enemy borders during the border wars, had moved through occupied land with nothing but his wolf sense and the particular discipline of a man who knows that any sound he makes in the wrong direction is his last sound. He fell back into that register now without thinking about it, the way old skills surface when the conditions require them. His awareness expanded. He read the forest. The first northern scout found them 4 miles past the river. Cale saw her before she showed herself, a flicker of gray in the trees to the northeast, too deliberate to be an animal. He stopped his group with a hand signal and stood in the open, which was the correct move. You stop and show yourself when you want a conversation. You keep moving when you want a confrontation. The scout dropped out of the trees 30 feet ahead of him. Young woman, wolf-fast even in human form, with the particular quality of someone who had grown up in hard territory and had the economy of movement to prove it. She looked at his northern leathers and his unmarked companions, and she looked at him, and she did not reach for the blade at her hip. "Your kingdom," she said. "I was," Kyle said. "I need to speak to Ronan Vex." "Vex doesn't take meetings with kingdom wolves." Then tell him I'm not here as a kingdom wolf. Tell him I'm here for the woman and the child. The scout's expression didn't change in any identifiable way, but something in her posture did. A slight reorientation, like a compass needle finding north. Stay here, she said. She was gone into the trees. He waited. His wolves held their positions without being told. The forest was very quiet in the way forests are quiet when they're paying attention. When the scout came back, she brought 2 others with her, and the message she carried was 6 words. Vex says come. Healer says no. Kale absorbed this. The woods around him, patient and cold, waited. The healer doesn't decide whether I come, he said. The scout looked at him with the flat expression of someone conveying information she personally found interesting. In Vex's territory, she said, the healer decides everything. The silence stretched between them like the frozen river, crossable, but not without cost, and not without the ice telling you exactly what it was willing to hold. And somewhere ahead, in a cabin that smelled of pine resin and wood smoke, Lyra Vale was holding her son and had already been told he was coming. Ronan Vex was 41 years old and had been running the Northern Territories since he was 26, which meant he had 15 years of experience reading men who came to his land believing their authority traveled with them. He read Kyle Draven in the first 30 seconds. Not the king part. The king part was obvious, written in the way the man moved through space as though space had always rearranged itself around him, and he had stopped noticing. What Ronan read was the other part. The part that had walked 3 days through enemy territory in unmarked leathers with 3 wolves instead of 300. The part that had stopped in the open when the scout found him instead of pushing forward. The part that, when given the message that the healer said no, had stood in the cold for a full minute before responding. That part was a man who understood, at some functional level, that he had lost the right to dictate terms. Ronan didn't trust it. Understanding something and having it change your behavior were 2 different things, and he had seen enough powerful men come to that particular threshold and turn back from it that he treated the appearance of humility in kings the way he treated thin ice, present, possibly load-bearing, not to be trusted until tested. He met Kale at the edge of the settlement with 6 of his best wolves flanking him and his hands at his sides, which was the northern greeting for someone you were willing to talk to but not willing to relax around. You made good time, Ronan said. I didn't stop much, Kyle said. They looked at each other. 2 large men in a cold forest, both of them carrying the particular density of people who had been in enough life-or-death situations that their bodies had learned to run a constant background assessment of every person they faced. The assessment was mutual, and both of them knew it. She won't see you, Ronan said. I know. Your scout told me. I'm telling you again so we're clear that it's not a negotiating position. It's her call. In my territory, her call stands. Kyle's jaw worked slightly, the only visible sign of what that cost him to hear. I understand, he said. Ronan studied him for another moment. Then he stepped back and gestured toward the main building. You can stay the night. Your wolves, too. We'll feed you. He paused. She knows you're here. What happens next is up to her timeline, not yours. And if her timeline is never? Then you go home empty, Ronan said, and you live with that. But Lyra knew he was 40 yards away, and she was not going to the window. She was sitting on the floor of the back room with Soren in her lap. She had named him that 3 days after his birth, a northern name, nothing from the kingdom records, nothing that carried the weight of a lineage he hadn't asked to be born into. He was 5 months old and already doing things that made Venna go quiet in that particular way that meant she was recalibrating. His wolf aura pulsed at irregular intervals, strong and directionless the way a new fire is strong before it learns to burn clean. When it spiked, the wolves in the settlement felt it, not painfully, but the way you feel a change in barometric pressure, something in your body adjusting to a new condition without being told to. Lyra felt it as warmth. Every time. The specific warmth of something that was hers. She was nursing him when Venna came in, which Venna registered without comment and sat down across from her on the low bench with the expression that meant she had something to say and was deciding how to say it. He's not what I expected, Venna said finally. No. I expected someone who looked more comfortable. Lyra didn't look up from Soren. He's always been comfortable. That's part of the problem. He doesn't look comfortable now. Venna was quiet for a moment. He looks like a man who's been shown a bill he didn't know he'd run up. He ran it up, Lyra said. Knowing or not knowing doesn't change the total. Venna accepted this. She had the quality Lyra had come to rely on. She didn't push past what the conversation was actually saying toward what she wanted it to say. She sat with what was true. Ronan gave him the night, she said. I know. That means you have until morning to decide whether you'll hear him out or not. Lyra's hand stilled on Soren's back. She looked at the wall opposite, the rough pine planking, the small window with its square of gray afternoon sky, the world outside that had been hers for 5 months now, a world she had built from nothing because everything else had been taken, her hands, her knowledge, her refusal to stop. If I hear him out, she said, he'll make a case. He's good at making cases. Yes. And some part of me will want to believe it. She said it without self-pity, just cataloging a fact. That's not weakness. It's just what happens when you've been close to someone. The neural pathways don't care about what they deserve. Venna looked at her carefully. What do you want to do? Lyra looked down at Soren. His eyes were closed, his small hand fisted loosely against her. His aura was quiet now, that deep, rhythmic pulse of a sleeping child, and in it she could feel the weight of what he was and what it was going to cost to keep him safe in a world that was already organizing itself around getting to him. I want to understand why he's here, she said. Not the official reason. The real one. Ask Ronan. He read him in the first pass. I know. She adjusted Soren carefully, settling him against her shoulder. What did Ronan say? Venna's expression shifted. He said the man who showed up at the tree line was not the same man who runs the kingdom. That could mean a lot of things. He said it like it was a problem, Venna said, not a reassurance. Lyra absorbed this. Outside, the settlement was moving through its early evening routine. The sounds of people ending their day, the particular rhythm of a place that had learned to be efficient because inefficiency was a luxury they couldn't afford. Somewhere in that routine, 40 yards away, Kyle Draven was sitting in Ronan's main hall eating food someone had brought him and not being the king. She wondered what that felt like. She suspected it felt like standing on ground that wasn't finished settling. Tell Ronan I'll see him at dawn, she said, outside, in the open. Venna nodded, stood. Then, at the door, Lyra. What? Whatever he says, whatever he shows you. Venna's voice was quiet, but it had the quality of a structural element, something that would hold weight. You built this, not him. Don't let him walk in here and make you forget that. Lyra met her eyes. I haven't forgotten anything, she said. That's the whole problem. Dawn came gray and sharp, the kind of northern morning that strips everything down to its actual elements, cold, light, distance, the specific silence of a world that hasn't warmed up enough yet to make noise. Lyra was at the eastern edge of the settlement when Kyle came out of the main hall. She had Soren wrapped against her chest in the carrier Court had made, his face turned inward toward her warmth, sleeping. She had positioned herself with her back to the settlement wall so she could see the approach and the flanking angles both. Old habit, newer than she would have liked. Kyle stopped 10 feet from her. He looked worse than she'd expected, which was saying something because she'd expected bad. The 3 days of northern travel were written on him in the granular way of actual physical cost. Not performance, not the deliberate roughness of a man who wanted to appear serious. His eyes had the quality of someone who hadn't slept properly in longer than 3 days, and there was a stillness in the way he held himself that she recognized, belatedly, as the stillness of a man managing pain he wasn't going to mention. She looked at him the way she looked at patients, not unkindly, not warmly, accurately. You know what you're looking at, he said. Yes. The full picture. Fen found the file, she said. It wasn't a question. She had been running the scenario forward since the traitor came through with news of a kingdom reward, and Fen finding the file was the most logical trigger. Sarath's documentation. Yes. Kael's voice was even. He was working to keep it that way and doing a reasonable job of it. Lyra? Don't start with my name, she said. It makes it sound like the beginning of an apology, and I'm not interested in apologies. He stopped. Reset. All right, he said. Then I'll start with what's true. The plague is going to take the kingdom's bloodlines inside 2 years. The pureblood documentation is confirmed. Sarath's records go back 4 decades, and they're thorough. The child you're carrying... He stopped, corrected himself. The child you have. He is the only genetic line that can restore the dominant strain in the affected bloodlines. Without him, the pack structure of Ironfang collapses within a generation. I know all of this, Lyra said. I know you do. Then you understand that telling me the kingdom needs my son is not a compelling opening. Something moved through his expression. Not shame, exactly, because Kael Draven had not been raised to access shame easily. More like the recognition of a miscalculation, the adjustment of someone who had prepared for one kind of conversation and arrived at a different one. What would be a compelling opening, he said. Lyra looked at him for a moment. There isn't one, she said. That's what I'm telling you. There is no sentence you can start with that undoes what happened in that throne room. You are not here to open a conversation. You're here to understand what you destroyed and figure out whether any of the pieces are salvageable. Those are different things. Kael was quiet. The morning was very cold. His breath came out in slow white plumes. You're right, he said. She hadn't expected that. She kept her face level and her breathing steady, but something in her chest registered the words the way a body registers unexpected weight. A shift, small but real. I was handed an accusation that fit a narrative I was already running, he said. I wanted the plague to have a cause I could point at and remove. You were convenient. I told myself I was making an objective assessment, and I was doing the opposite. His voice was flat. Not performative in its flatness, just stripped. I knew you. I knew your work. I made the choice anyway because the choice was easy, and the truth was complicated, and I am... He stopped. I was the kind of man who preferred easy. The gray morning sat around them. Soren shifted against her chest, a small, unconscious adjustment, his aura pulsing once in that warm, directionless way. Kael's eyes moved to the bundle against her chest. Something crossed his face that she hadn't seen before. Not entitlement, not the calculating assessment of a man looking at a strategic resource. Something rawer than that. Something that didn't have a political application. She didn't let herself interpret it. Not yet. Why did you come yourself, she said. Fen could have sent an envoy. Sarath could have written documentation. You didn't need to cross 3 days of hostile territory in person. Because an envoy would have been saying what I told him to say, Kael said, and I owed you the actual thing. She studied him. He held her gaze the way he hadn't in the throne room. Not looking through her at the wall behind, but at her, with the full weight of whatever he was carrying and no performance layered over it. It was, she thought, possibly the most honest she had ever seen him. It was also, she thought, the most dangerous version of him she'd ever encountered. Not dangerous to her safety. Ronan's wolves were positioned at 3 angles she'd mapped before Kael walked out of the hall. Dangerous to her judgment. Because this version was the one she could almost believe, and almost was the most expensive word in any negotiation. She was going to say something. She hadn't decided what, but something, when Pell came at a dead run from the northern perimeter. He was fast, even for a wolf who'd been living rough, and his face had the particular quality that Lyra had learned to read in the months she'd spent in this settlement. Not fear, which Pell managed in a narrow, controlled band, but the thing that came before fear when someone very competent understood that the situation had just exceeded their competence. He skidded to a stop 6 feet from her and didn't look at Kael at all. Venna, he said. North perimeter. 8 wolves. Armed. Not northern clan. Lyra's hand went to Soren's back automatically. Clan markings? None. Leathers like his. His eyes cut to Kael for the first time. Kingdom style. But not kingdom colors. Kael turned. His entire body had changed, the openness of the conversation gone, replaced by the operational register she recognized from the throne room, but the throne room version had been performance. This was the actual thing. How long ago did they cross the Threnfell? He said to Pell. Scout says they were past the river before dawn. Then they didn't follow me, Kael said, and his voice had something in it that Lyra, watching him, identified as the specific quality of a man understanding something terrible. They were already moving. Who? Lyra said. He turned to her, and in his face she saw it. The rewriting of the last 12 minutes, the scenario running forward in his mind the same way she ran scenarios, reaching the same conclusion she was about to reach. The name's on Serath's second file, he said. The council members who arranged your exile. I told them I was leaving. I told them I was going north. His jaw was set. I didn't tell them why. But they knew, Lyra said. They knew. He said it with a flatness that was not about control anymore, but about impact. The specific flatness of a man absorbing the information that people he had trusted were the architects of everything that had destroyed the last year. They would have known the moment I pulled Fen and Serath into that room. They've had ears in every council meeting for years. I walked out of the Citadel, and they sent ahead. They want the child, Lyra said. They want the child dead, Kael said. If the heir exists and is confirmed pureblood, the manipulation they've built the last 8 years on becomes undeniable. The plague, the exile, it all comes apart. His eyes met hers. A living heir is the end of everything they've arranged. Ronan came out of the main hall at a pace that meant he'd been listening and had already made his assessment. He had his weapon at his hip and his 6 best wolves behind him, and the expression of a man who had been preparing for a version of this day for the entirety of his adult life. He looked at Kael, not friendly, not hostile, precise. How many total? He said. 8 visible, Pell said. I counted 2 scout positions that hadn't moved in the rotation windows. That means positioned early. Could be a second wave. Could be 20, Ronan said. He looked at Kael again. You brought this here. Yes, Kael said. No argument. Then you helped fix it. Yes, Kael said again. Something passed between the 2 men. Not trust, because trust wasn't a thing you built in 60 seconds in a northern settlement with armed wolves closing in from the tree line, but a functional agreement, a shared assessment of what the situation required. Lyra was already moving toward the back building. Soren pressed close, her mind running the settlement's layout, the exits, the defensible positions, the specific arithmetic of 8 armed wolves against Ronan's 12, and whatever Kael and his 3 could add. Kael's hand caught her arm. Not grabbing. A contact. A question. She stopped, looked at his hand, looked at his face. I need to know you'll move when I tell you to move, he said. Not because I have authority here. Because I know their tactics, and Ronan doesn't. She looked at him for a long moment. The morning was fully gray now, the light flat and cold, and somewhere in the northern trees 8 wolves who had been sent by men who had already unmade her life once were moving into position. Her son's aura pulsed against her chest. Warm, directionless, enormous. Tell Ronan what you know, she said. He makes the calls. You advise. She held his gaze. That's the only version of this where I stay in the same building as you. Kael's hand dropped. He nodded once. Lyra turned and walked. Behind her, she heard him moving toward Ronan, his voice dropping into the flat operational tone of a man who had been in enough genuine fights to know the difference between authority and usefulness, and who was choosing, right now, to be useful. She didn't look back. She was watching the tree line when the first arrow came out of it, and the settlement exploded into motion around her, and the long negotiation of the past hour collapsed into the only language the world had ever reliably spoken to her. Survive. Move. Don't stop. She ran. The arrow took Pell in the left shoulder and spun him sideways into the settlement wall before anyone had finished processing that the first one had missed. Lyra heard the impact, the specific dense sound of a broadhead finding muscle, and her body responded before her mind had finished its sentence. She pulled Soren tighter against her chest and dropped below the sight line of the eastern wall, moving at a crouch toward the storage building 20 yards back. Her knees hit frozen ground twice. She didn't register the pain. The cold air tasted like iron. Behind her, Ronan's voice cut through the settlement in short, hard commands that told her he'd been expecting something like this for long enough to have prepared for it. Not this specifically, but something. The Northern Territories did not produce men who were surprised by violence. She reached the storage building and pressed her back against the far wall. Soren was awake now, his eyes open, his aura spiking in that pressured way she'd come to read as his response to her elevated heart rate. He didn't cry. He looked at her face with the focused attention of a 5-month-old who was doing the only thing he could do, which was witness. She put her hand against the back of his head. Steady pressure. She breathed out slowly. "I've got you," she said. Quiet even. A statement of fact. His aura settled by about half. She looked around the corner of the building. The eastern approach was chaos, 2 of Ronan's wolves engaging the flanking pair that had come in behind the tree line on a low arc, using the iron pines as cover. The attackers moved with the particular economy of trained kingdom soldiers, which meant they had been briefed on the settlement layout before they arrived, which meant someone had fed them information, which meant the information infrastructure around this location had been compromised for longer than this morning. She filed it, moved. The back route to the main building was 30 yards of open ground with a woodpile as the only available cover at the midpoint. She measured it. Measured Soren's weight against her chest, the carrier's security, her own speed in hard-soled northern boots on frozen earth. She ran. She hit the woodpile at full pace and came around it without stopping, because stopping in open ground was dying, and she had established a policy about that. An arrow struck the woodpile behind her at the height her head had been half a second earlier. She didn't look back. She reached the main building and shoved through the side door and found Venna inside with a blade drawn, and 2 of the settlement's younger wolves flanking her. Venna looked at Lyra, then at Soren, then at the door. "Pell," she said. "Left shoulder. He was standing when I last saw him." Lyra crossed to the back window and looked out. "How many on the western side?" "Court says 4. They came in from 2 directions, which means they planned the split approach." Venna's voice was operational, stripped of everything that wasn't useful. "They're not trying to take the settlement. They're trying to create enough chaos to get one person through to you." "I know." Lyra had known since the first arrow, which had missed in the particular way of someone calibrating a shot, rather than taking the best available one. Killing her meant killing the child, and they needed to confirm what the child was before they made that call. They wanted her contained, panicked, separated from the wolves protecting her. They'll push the perimeter until Ronan has to pull everyone to the walls, then one of them comes through the gap. "We don't let them create the gap," Venna said. "Ronan knows that. Ronan has 12 wolves against what might be 20. That gap is going to appear whether he lets it or not." Lyra looked at her. Venna's broken-nosed face was set, her eyes moving through the same calculation, both of them arriving at the same number. "I need to move Soren to the northern cache," Lyra said. "Underground. If they breach—" "No." Venna stepped in front of the door, not aggressive, blocking. "That cache has 1 exit. You put him down there, they find it, there's nowhere to go." "Then what?" The south wall exploded. Not literally, but close enough that Lyra's body treated it as equivalent. A controlled breach. Something heavy swung at the base of the pine log construction, the wall giving way in a low section that put a hole 2 feet off the ground and wide enough for a man to roll through fast. The 2 young wolves went for it immediately, and Lyra grabbed Soren with both arms and backed against the north wall as the first attacker came through. He was fast. Kingdom trained fast, with the full shift adaptation that gave Kingdom wolves their particular combat efficiency in human form. Reflexes tuned to wolf speed, muscle memory built on years of formal training that no northern pack had the resources to replicate. He put the first young wolf down in 2 seconds with a technique Lyra recognized as Iron Fang close quarters doctrine, efficient and brutal. Designed to incapacitate rather than kill because they wanted the building intact. Venna engaged him before the second wolf could. Lyra did not watch. She moved left along the wall toward the interior door, calculating the path through the main hall to the north exit, measuring it against how long Venna could hold one trained soldier before the second one came through the hole. A hand caught the back of the carrier, not Venna's hand. She spun, putting her body between the grip and Soren, and found herself face to face with a man she recognized, not from personal acquaintance but from type. Council guard, the kind assigned to senior council members rather than the king, which meant he wasn't Kael's man. He had the build of someone who had been doing this work for 20 years, and the eyes of someone who had been told this particular job was sanctioned at the highest level and had chosen to believe that rather than look at it too closely. "The child," he said, low, flat, controlled. "Give me the child and you walk out of this." Lyra looked at him. Her heart was running at a rate that should have been interfering with her cognition and wasn't, because the body under enough pressure sometimes finds a clarity it can't access any other way. Every extraneous thing burned off. What was left was the essential question and the essential answer. "No," she said. He reached for Soren. She broke his wrist, not with a weapon, with the specific anatomical knowledge of a healer who understood exactly where the bones were and exactly how much lateral force the joint could absorb before the structure gave. The sound was bad. He reacted the way people react to unexpected agony, the brief whiteout before the body catches up with what happened. And in that window she was already moving, through the interior door, into the main hall. Kael was in the main hall. He was bleeding from a cut above his eye that had painted the left side of his face red, and he had one of the attacker wolves on the ground and was engaged with a second one. And when Lyra came through the door, his eyes found her in the specific way that eyes find things when every other input is running at capacity and one particular input cuts through all of it. He dropped the second attacker with a move that was not clean. It was ugly and efficient and costly, his shoulder taking an impact that made his left arm drop. And then he was at her side. "North exit," he said. "I know the layout," she said. "They have the north exit covered. I saw the positioning on the way in." He was already moving, his hand not on her arm but close, his body angled to put himself between her and the breach in the south wall. "There's a low run on the eastern wall near the wood store. The ground cover starts 12 feet out. If we move fast enough—" "Pell," she said. "Court has Pell. He's mobile." Kael's voice was flat and direct and had none of the throne room register in it, none of the performing authority. This was operational and unadorned and was, in its stripped-down form, the most useful version of him she had ever encountered. "Ronan is pulling the wolves from the south perimeter to create a gap on the east side. We have about 90 seconds before they realize what he's doing and close it." She looked at him. Blood running freely down his face, his left arm not quite tracking right, his eyes clear and direct. "If we run for that gap," she said, "you're putting yourself between us and whoever's on the east approach." "Yes." "Your shoulder is damaged." "Yes." She held his gaze for 1 second. It was a second she didn't have. "Go," she said. They went. The eastern run was 60 feet of open ground from the building to the tree line, and the 90-second window Kael had described was optimistic by about 45 seconds. They were 20 feet from the tree line when the second wave hit the eastern perimeter. Lyra heard them before she saw them. The particular sound of multiple bodies moving through undergrowth at speed, not bothering with quiet anymore because quiet had stopped being useful. She counted the sound signatures. 4, 5. Moving on a converging angle that would cut them off before the tree line. Kael heard it too. She knew because she felt the shift in the air beside her, the specific change in a person's movement quality when they are making a decision they have already accepted the cost of. "Don't stop," he said. Then he turned. She ran. She did not turn around. She heard the impact behind her, bodies, the sharp sound of trained violence, Kael's voice giving a single sharp command to his 3 wolves who had materialized from somewhere on the flank. She heard something else too, beneath the fight sounds. A tone, not from any person, but from Soren, whose aura had stopped pulsing in its normal directionless way and had gathered itself into something focused. She felt it in her sternum, a pressure, not painful. Something old. She hit the tree line and pressed behind the first large trunk and looked back. Kael had engaged all 5 of them. His 3 wolves were handling 2 on the right flank, and he had taken the other 3 himself, which was not a sustainable arrangement. His left arm was working now in the sense that it was moving, but it was moving wrong, compensating. The shoulder joint doing things it was not meant to do. He was fast, faster than she had given him credit for, because she had seen him in the throne room context where speed was not a variable that mattered. In this context, it mattered, and he was using it fully. The border war training that had put that scar on his jaw surfacing in the clean economy of someone who has been in enough real fights to have burned away everything unnecessary. He was also losing. Not quickly. But the math was the math, 5-1 with a compromised shoulder, and the men coming at him were fresh and had the numbers and knew it. The first hit landed on his right side, below the ribs. She saw him absorb it and keep moving, which was what you did, which was the only option. The second hit took his left knee sideways and he dropped briefly before getting back up. And the dropping and getting back up was the thing that told her the true state of things, because Kael Draven did not drop unless the drop was mandatory. She looked at the tree line ahead of her, the forest route to Ronan's secondary cache point, where Court would be moving with Pell, where the settlement's children had been evacuated when the attack started. 30 minutes of running, safe distance. She looked back at the open ground. He was still on his feet. 3 of the 5 attackers were now focused on him, the other 2 having broken to chase her and been pulled back by the realization that he was a more immediate problem. His wolves had neutralized one of the right flank pair and were struggling with the second. He looked up, just once, through the gap between 2 of the men working to take him down. He looked at her in the tree line, at Soren against her chest. His expression was not a plea. It was not a command. It was something she didn't have a clean word for. The expression of a man who has made a choice that costs him everything, and has found, in making it, that the cost is the only honest thing he has done in a very long time. She had seen that expression once before, on her own face, in the reflection of the frozen river, on the morning she'd walked away from the kingdom with nothing but a secret and a refusal to stop. Soren's aura spiked, not the gentle pulse of sleep or the reactive flutter of his mother's heartbeat. A full spike, sudden and enormous, the kind that rewrote the air around it. Lyra felt it travel through her ribcage and keep going, outward, in a ring, through the ground and the trees and the open territory between her and the settlement. She saw the wolves in the open ground react to it involuntarily, heads turning, bodies losing their vectors for half a second, as every wolf sense in range fired at once. Half a second was enough. Kyle took it. He took it with everything he had left, drove forward into the gap with the last of his functional momentum, put the nearest attacker down with a technique that had no elegance and all necessity, and got to one knee in the open ground. His left arm was hanging wrong. His right hand was braced on the frozen earth. He was looking at her. The 2 remaining attackers regrouped behind him. They were between him and the settlement now. His 3 wolves had the flank pair contained but not finished. Ronan's voice came from the northern tree line, a command bark that meant his wolves were moving in, that the perimeter collapse he'd engineered was closing, that the settlement's counterpush was in motion. But between Kael and that counterpush, 30 feet of open ground, 2 fresh attackers, and a left arm that wasn't going to answer what he needed it to answer. Lyra watched him assess it, watched him run the same numbers she was running, watched him arrive at the same conclusion she was arriving at, which was that the numbers didn't work, that Ronan's wolves were 40 seconds out, and that 40 seconds was a specific and definitive amount of time. "Go," he said. His voice carried the distance clearly, stripped of everything except the word itself. She did not go. She stepped out of the tree line. Kael's expression shattered. "Lyra, they don't want me dead," she said, walking forward with Soren pressed against her, her voice even, and carrying the same quality his had carried. Stripped down, no performance. "You've known that since the first arrow. If they wanted me dead, this would have been a different operation." She stopped 12 feet from him, between him and the 2 regrouped attackers. "They want the child confirmed and then eliminated. They need me alive long enough to make the identification." The 2 attackers had stopped. She could see them recalculating, their training conflicting with the unexpected geometry of what was in front of them. The target they were protecting and the target they were hunting occupying the same ground. "That means," Lyra said, not to Kael but to the 2 men behind him, loud enough that they understood she was speaking directly to them, "that you will not fire on me." And anyone who comes after him, she moved to Kael's side, put herself in the shot line, goes through me and the child to do it. The silence was the longest half-second she had ever stood inside. Ronan's wolves hit the perimeter. The operation collapsed in the way operations collapse when the timing shifts and the objective becomes untenable. Not with drama, but with the sudden absence of coherent pressure, the two attackers breaking for the eastern tree line as the numbers turned against them, Ronan's 12 moving through the settlement's exterior with the grim efficiency of people reclaiming their own ground. Lyra knelt beside Kael. Up close, the damage was worse. The shoulder was dislocated at minimum. She could see the line of it wrong through his layers. The right side hit had cracked at least 2 ribs. His face was a mask of blood from the head cut that had never stopped, and beneath all of it he was pale in the specific way of someone whose body is running its reserves down to the bone. He looked at her. His breathing was controlled and very deliberate, the breathing of someone managing pain through discipline because they don't have another option. "You came back," he said. "I know their doctrine," she said, her hands already on his shoulder, reading the joint. "I needed them to stop shooting at you." "That's not why you came back." She didn't answer. She was focused on the shoulder, on the specific problem in front of her hands, on the work. Her hands knew what to do. They had always known what to do. That had never been the question. "This is going to hurt," she said. "I'm aware." She put the shoulder back. He made no sound, which told her more about what he'd trained himself to be than anything he'd said in the past 2 days. Soren's hand, from inside the carrier, found the edge of Kael's sleeve. Tiny fingers, barely coordinated, the reflexive reach of an infant responding to proximity and warmth. Lyra felt it and looked down. Kael looked down. The gray stone eyes were open and focused on Kael's face with the particular intensity her son applied to everything he hadn't classified yet. Something happened in Kael's expression that she did not have clean language for and did not try to name. Ronan appeared at her shoulder. He looked at the scene in front of him, Lyra, Kael, the child's hand on the sleeve, and said nothing for a moment. His face was unreadable in the way of a man who is updating his model of a situation and not sharing the update. "Settlement's clear," he said. "For now." "They'll regroup," Kael said. His voice was steady despite the ribs. "What came today was a probe. The council will know it failed within the hour. What comes next won't be 8 wolves." "How many?" Ronan said. Kael looked at him. This was the threshold. The place where the information he was about to share made him fully complicit in whatever Ronan decided to do with it. The place where the authority structure he'd spent his life operating inside became less important than the problem in front of him. He crossed it without hesitating. "The Council has access to 3 secondary companies of Kingdom soldiers who operate outside the official chain of command," he said. 60 wolves each. They can have 2 of them at the Threnfell inside 4 days. Ronan absorbed this. 120 wolves against my 12. "You're 12 plus 3, Kael said. "And whatever I can pull from the Kingdom's loyalist guard if I can get a message to Aldrich before the Council shuts down the communication lines. And if they've already shut them down." Kael was quiet for 1 beat. "Then 120 against 15, he said. The northern forest was cold and very quiet around them. Somewhere in the settlement, Pell was being attended to. The 2 children who had been evacuated were in the cache, waiting to be told it was safe to come out. The settlement that 12 people had built in hard country over years of careful work was standing, for now, with a hole in its south wall and blood on its eastern ground. Ronan looked at the hole in the south wall, looked at the tree line, looked at Kael with the precise, undecorated assessment of a man who has spent 15 years making decisions that determined whether the people depending on him lived or didn't. "You said you're not here as the king," Ronan said. "I'm not," Kael said. "Then what can you actually do? Not the title. Not the army you might or might not be able to reach. You, here, now, with a bad shoulder and 2 cracked ribs. What are you worth to the 15 of us who are about to face 120? The question sat in the cold air. Kael didn't look at Lyra when he answered. He looked at Ronan, and the answer he gave was not the answer of a king calculating leverage. It was the answer of a man who had spent 2 days stripping the performance off himself until what was underneath was visible, and who had found, in the stripping, that what was underneath was less impressive than the performance and more real than anything he'd said in years. "I know every weakness in Kingdom military doctrine," he said. "I built half of it. I know which of those 60 wolf companies will follow council orders without question and which ones won't if I'm standing in front of them asking them to stand down. And I know—" He stopped, looked at Soren. "I know that what's in this child is the only thing that ends the plague, which means it's the only thing that ends the justification for everything the council has built. Which means the argument for protecting him is not about bloodlines or thrones. It's about every wolf in every territory dying of something that can be stopped." Ronan studied him for a long time. Lyra watched Ronan study him and did not offer an opinion, because the opinion she had was not finished forming, and she had learned enough about herself in the past 6 months to know that unfinished opinions, when spoken aloud, had a way of becoming prematurely permanent. "Get inside," Ronan said finally. "Both of you. We plan tonight and we move at first light." He walked back toward the settlement. His wolves followed. Kael moved to stand, his ribs making the process audible. Lyra did not offer her arm. He didn't ask for it. He got upright through the mechanics of will and functional stubbornness, and they walked back toward the settlement wall side by side, with Soren between them and 120 wolves 4 days out, and the full weight of every decision either of them had ever made accumulating overhead, like weather that was done threatening and ready to arrive. 12 feet from the wall, Kael said, "I'm sorry." 2 words. No qualification, no explanation, no architecture built around it to make it safer to say. Lyra kept walking. She looked straight ahead at the gap in the south wall that was going to need to be rebuilt before nightfall. "I know," she said. It was not forgiveness, it was not dismissal. It was something more specific than either, an acknowledgement that the words had landed, that they were real, that reality was in fact the starting point rather than the ending one. She walked through the gap in the wall and into the work that remained. Behind her, 4 days out across the frozen territories, 120 wolves were already moving north. And in his office in the Iron Fang Citadel, the council member whose name had been on Serath's file received the message that the probe had failed, and made the decision that Kael Draven was no longer the king, and that the heir would not survive the second operation. He sent the order before the fire in his grate had finished reading the first report. The 4 days passed like a held breath. Ronan ran the settlement on a war footing without calling it that. There was no drama in it, no speech-making, no ritual preparation. He simply reorganized the daily work around the reality of what was coming, the same way you reorganize around a hard winter, methodically, without sentiment, with full attention to the specific problem rather than the abstract fear of it. The south wall was repaired before nightfall on the first day. Sightlines were cleared on the eastern approach. The children in Pell, whose shoulder was healing under Lyra's attention, were moved to the secondary cache as a permanent arrangement rather than an emergency one. Kael spent the first day horizontal because Lyra told him to and because his body confirmed her assessment every time he tested it against her instructions. His ribs were cracked in 2 places and his shoulder, relocated, needed 48 hours before it would carry weight again. He submitted to this with the particular quality of a man who has spent a lifetime treating his body as a tool and has recently been forced to revise his relationship with tools. Respect, now, where there used to be only demand. He spent the time watching the settlement work. He had been in Northern Territories during the border wars 14 years ago, moving through them as an enemy and later as a negotiator when the strategic calculus shifted. He had understood then what the North produced in people, a specific kind of competence that throne room politics didn't cultivate, a fluency in the actual elements of survival that the kingdom's formal power structures insulated you from needing. He had understood it abstractly, the way you understand things that don't require you to change. Watching Ronan's 12 move through their routines now, he understood it differently. The difference between knowing something and knowing it in your body, the knowledge that only comes from having been stripped of the alternatives. Lyra came to check his ribs on the second evening. She worked with her usual economy, hands-on, accurate, no excess contact, no commentary that wasn't medically relevant. He watched her face while she worked, the focused quality of it, the way her attention was fully present in the problem her hands were solving and nowhere else. How long did it take, he said. Before this felt like home. She didn't look up. Ask me when it stops. He absorbed this. It hasn't. Parts of it have. She pressed along his ribline, reading the bone through the skin. The work, the people. Soren being born here. A pause. The rest is still... She stopped, chose a different word than the one she'd started with. Unresolved. I made it unresolved. You contributed. She sat back. The council contributed. Sarath contributed by keeping his silence for 11 years. I contributed by never pushing back hard enough, early enough, to make the cost of targeting me higher than the benefit. She looked at him directly for the first time in the examination. Blame is easy accounting. It doesn't tell you what to build next. He held her gaze. What are you building? I don't know yet. She gathered her kit. I know what I'm not building. I'm not building something that depends on anyone else's permission to stand. She left. He lay in the dark with his cracked ribs and his reoriented shoulder and the particular quality of silence that follows something that has just told you exactly where you stand. He thought it was possibly the most honest thing anyone had said to him since before the throne. The wolves came on the morning of the 4th day, out of a sky that was white and flat, and gave no particular warning. Ronan had scouts posted at 3-mile intervals from the Threnfell, and the first signal came in before dawn. 2 short, 1 long, repeated, which meant large force, confirmed hostile moving fast. By the time the sun cleared the tree line, the settlement was already deployed, and Kyle was on his feet with his shoulders strapped and his ribs taped, and the clear operational knowledge that both of these accommodations were temporary and would fail at some point during what was coming. The wolves numbered closer to 90 than 120. Someone in the council's logistics had miscounted, or the communication lines had been partially disrupted. Aldrich, possibly, who had received Kyle's message through a route that had a 40% chance of getting through, and apparently had. 90 was still 90 against 15. Kyle stood with Ronan at the settlement's northern approach and looked at the numbers coming through the trees and felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Clarity. Not the clarity of a man who knows he's going to win. The harder kind. The kind that comes when you've removed every possible exit and found that the absence of alternatives is, paradoxically, a form of freedom. This was the thing about being stripped down to the essential question. The answer became obvious. Not easy. Obvious. And there was a profound difference between those two things that he had spent 29 years confusing. The front company, he said to Ronan, pointing. 3rd row, the wolves in gray leathers. Those are from the Craven Hill garrison. Their commander is a man named Set. He served under me in the border wars. He follows orders, but he follows them because he understands the chain of command, not because he's incapable of questioning it. Ronan looked at the gray-leathered row. You think he'll stand down? I think if I'm standing in front of him and the argument is sound, there's a chance. Kael paused. A smaller chance if I'm standing behind a settlement wall when I make the argument. Ronan looked at him. The same assessing look as the first meeting, but recalibrated now. Not reading a stranger, but reading a man he had 3 days of data on. You walk out there, Ronan said, and the council's personal guard in the front row puts an arrow in you before you finish your first sentence. Probably, Kael said, unless there's something that gives the Craven Hill Wolves a reason to stop them. A beat. The child, Ronan said. The child's aura, Kael said, at full spike. Every wolf in that approach line felt it during the first attack. They won't have known what it was. If they feel it again while I'm standing in the open making an argument about the pureblood heir, the genetic response doesn't care about council orders. It's older than orders. Ronan was quiet for a moment. His jaw was set. His eyes were doing what Kael had come to recognize as his highest functioning mode, reading everything, discarding nothing, making the calculation with full information. I'm not using an infant as a tactical asset, he said. I'm not asking you to. Kael turned to look at him fully. I'm asking you to let me stand in front of those wolves and make the argument. What Soren does or doesn't do isn't something either of us controls. He paused. It's something he already does when conditions require it. I've watched him for 3 days, so have you. Ronan looked at the approaching force, at the gray-leathered row, at the settlement behind him. "You get 30 seconds," he said. "If it doesn't work in 30 seconds, we pull back to the wall and we hold as long as we hold." "Yes," Kyle said. He walked out of the settlement. The force stopped at 200 yards when they registered a single man in the open. Kyle walked to 150 and stopped. The cold air moved through the northern forest. 90 wolves in formation. At the front, the council's personal guard, 12 men, tight formation, the particular posture of people who had been given both an order and the authorization to enforce it against anyone who obstructed it. Behind them, the gray-leathered Cravenhill row. Cale found Set's face in the formation. 42 years old, gray at the temples, the built-in stillness of a man who had been in enough battles to have stopped being interested in their drama. Cale raised his voice. "Commander Set." Flat, carrying, the command voice he'd been trained into from childhood but was using now, without the performance layer. Just the voice. "You were told you were here to retrieve a stolen royal asset and neutralize a hostile force that had taken Kingdom Wolves prisoner." He paused. "Let it sit." "You were lied to," he said. "There are no Kingdom Wolves held here. The asset you were told to retrieve is a 5-month-old child who was born in exile because the council members who dispatched you arranged his mother's exile before he could be born inside Kingdom walls. Because a living pure-blood heir ends the political architecture they have spent 8 years building. You are not here on Kingdom business. You are here on their business, and there is a difference." The council's guard was moving, 3 of them breaking from the front formation, angling toward him. He kept talking. "The bloodline plague that has been taking your families for 2 years was engineered," he said. Louder now, past the guards, aimed at the second and third rows. "I have documentation from Elder Sarath's 40 years of records that names the architects. The child I'm asking you not to kill is the only living genetic line that carries the restoration marker. He is not a threat to Iron Fang. He is the reason your children will still be able to shift in 20 years, and the men who sent you here know that, which is why they need him dead before anyone else confirms it." The 3 guards were 15 feet from him. "I am Kyle Draven," he said, "Alpha King of Iron Fang, if that title still means anything to anyone in this formation. And I am telling you." The first guard reached him. The impact was hard and deliberate. Not a killing strike, a silencing one, the butt of a weapon aimed at his head. He took it on the shoulder, the bad shoulder, and went down on one knee with the specific white implosion of a pain that exceeded what the taped ribs and strapped joint had been designed to absorb. He stayed on his knee. He did not go down further. The second guard raised his weapon, and Soren's aura detonated. There was no other word for it. The pulse that had been building since dawn. Lyra had felt it in the carrier, felt it building the way pressure builds before a structural failure. Released outward in a ring that moved through the ground and the air simultaneously, the full concentrated force of the most intact pure-blood genetic line in 3 generations expressing itself without restraint or direction for the first time. It hit the formation like a physical wave. Every wolf in the approach line stopped, not tactically, involuntarily, the way a body stops when something in its foundational architecture responds to a signal it was built to respond to. Heads turning, bodies reorienting. The ancient instinct that ran underneath training and doctrine and political allegiance. The instinct that predated the kingdom itself, firing in 100 directions at once and arriving at the same recognition. The guard with the raised weapon stood with it raised and did not bring it down. His face had the expression of a man whose body had overridden the instruction from his brain. Set stepped out of the gray-leathered row. He walked forward through the stalled formation. He stopped in front of Kyle, who was still on one knee with his shoulder failing and his ribs registering their objection to the morning. He looked down at him for a long moment. Then he went down on one knee himself. "My lord," he said. Quiet. No performance. "Tell me what you need." Archet. What followed was not clean. It was never clean. The council's personal guard, when the formation shifted, broke into their own response. 6 of them moving for the settlement perimeter, 2 engaging Set's Cravenhill wolves, the remaining 4 turning back toward the tree line for a retreat that would become a report that would become, eventually, a legal and political crisis that would outlast the morning by years. Ronan's wolves came out of the settlement at a pace that turned the retreat into a containment. Kael's 3 joined them. Set's Cravenhill Company, 40 wolves who had spent the last hour following orders they now understood to have been fraudulent, moved with a discipline that was no longer in service of the council's instruction, but of something older. A chain of command that went deeper than appointment. The fighting lasted 20 minutes. By the end of it, 6 of the council guard were contained, 2 were dead in the tree line by their own choice rather than capture, and 4 had gotten into the eastern forest and would eventually, through channels Kael would spend the next 3 months closing, make their way back to the men who had sent them. Kael was upright for 12 of the 20 minutes. For the final 8, he was seated against the settlement wall with Lyra's hands on his shoulder again, her face close to his, her voice running the low operational commentary of a healer who needs her patient to stay present. "Stay with me," she said. "I'm here," he said. "You're very pale." "I'm aware." "The shoulder is dislocated again. I'm going to need you to breathe out on 3. "I know the procedure." "Then stop arguing about it." He breathed out on 3. She put it back. The white implosion was worse the second time, which he had expected. He waited for it to pass. It passed. She sat back on her heels and looked at him with the healer's look, assessing, methodical, running through the checklist. Then, when the checklist was satisfied, she looked at him with the other look, the one that wasn't about his shoulder. "You walked out there," she said. "Yes." "With 2 cracked ribs and a shoulder that was already failing." "It was the only play that had a reasonable probability." "It was not a reasonable probability," she said. "It was a 15% chance that Set remembered you clearly enough and trusted you enough to override the order he'd been given, combined with a variable that neither of us controlled." He looked at her. "Sometimes 15% is what you have." She was quiet for a moment. Her hands were still, which with Lyra he had learned to read as the absence of a task, which meant her full attention was in her head. "Why?" she said. "Not the tactical why. The other one." He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Outside, Ronan was organizing the aftermath, the contained council guards, the Cravenhill Company, the cleanup of a morning that had cost everyone something. Soren, from wherever Venna had taken him when the fighting started, pulsed once in that warm, directionless way that meant he was fine. That meant he was sleeping. That meant the enormous thing he carried was resting for now. "Because I spent 11 years, Kael said, building a way of existing that put distance between me and the cost of every decision I made. Exile an Omega healer. Someone else processes the paperwork. Consolidate power through noble bloodline politics. The nobles carry the social weight of it. Believe a convenient accusation. The accused deals with the consequences." He paused. "I had never once stood in the path of what I'd set in motion and said, 'This belongs to me. I own the trajectory of this. I will take the impact directly.'" Lyra was watching him. Her face was very still. "This morning," he said, "was the first time in my life that I stood in the actual path." He looked at his hands. The knuckles were split, the bad shoulder's arm still moving wrong. "I don't know if it makes anything right. I don't think it does. I think there are some costs that don't get balanced by anything that comes after." He looked at her. "But I know the difference between who I was in that throne room and who I was this morning, and the difference is not something I can unfeel." The northern morning was very quiet around them. The settlement smelled of pine resin and cold air and the particular metallic note that follows violence. "No," Lyra said, after a long moment. "It isn't." The council members were tried. Not in the throne room. Kael had suspended the formal court processes until the bloodline documentation could be fully entered into the public record, which Elder Serath completed over the following 3 months, with the methodical precision of a man who has been waiting to finish a task for 11 years. The trial happened in the full assembly hall, before every noble house and clan representative who could be summoned, with Serath's documentation presented in its entirety and Fenn's medical record supplementing it. 4 council members had known the full scope of the plague's origins. 2 had been present for the decision to engineer Lyra's exile. 1 had given the order that sent 90 wolves into Northern Territory to kill an infant. The sentences were not light, they were not cruel, they were precise, which was its own form of weight. The kind of accountability that doesn't perform itself, but simply settles into the structure of things, permanent and unignorable. Lyra was present for all of it. She sat in the assembly hall with Soren on her lap and watched the proceedings with the attention she had always brought to work she considered important. She did not speak during the trial, except when asked direct questions by the documentary record. Her answers were exact and without embellishment. Kael watched her from across the hall and understood that what he was watching was not a woman who had survived and was now receiving justice. It was a woman who had built something from nothing, who had walked out of a gate into the frozen north with cracked boots and a secret and a refusal to stop, and who was sitting in this hall not because she needed it, but because the institution needed her presence to fully account for what it had done. She was doing the institution a favor. The institution did not entirely deserve the favor. She was doing it anyway because the alternative, refusing the accounting, withdrawing from the process, would have left the damage in the walls where it would continue to work its way outward for another generation. She was doing it because someone had to, and she had learned, in the North, that the question of who had to do hard things and who wanted to were often answered the same way, by the person who was standing there. The restoration of Lyra's bloodline documentation was entered into the official record on a gray morning 6 months after the trial. Soren's genetic lineage was confirmed in the same session, pureblood heir of the Alpha founding line, the documentation complete and witnessed by every living elder the kingdom possessed. Kael signed the restoration papers at the assembly table with the full court present and then sat back and looked across the table at Lyra, who was reading the final copy with the attention she always brought to documents, checking the language. She found one error, a transcription mistake in the bloodline notation, a minor clerical issue that would have caused no practical problem but was technically incorrect. She pointed it out to the recorder without comment. It was corrected. She nodded. Done. He watched her through all of this and thought about what it meant to witness someone in their full dimension. Not the dimension of what they meant to you, not the dimension of how they fit into your structure, but the full dimension of what they actually were. The healer who had saved Venna's girl with her own marrow. The woman who had walked 12 days through hostile territory with a secret she had chosen to carry alone. The person who had stepped out of the tree line when the numbers were bad, because abandoning someone she had decided to be accountable to was a thing she did not do. He had made her a target. He had handed her to the cold and the dark and the north. And she had walked into the dark and made herself out of what she found there. That was not a story about him. That was not a story that needed him in it. He understood this clearly and completely, and the clarity was not comfortable, and was also, he had found, the only version of the truth he was able to live in anymore. She looked up from the corrected document, found him looking, held his gaze for a moment with the specific attention she gave to things she was reading carefully. "It's done," she said. "Yes," he said. "Then we need to talk about the Northern Territories. Ronan's people." "I know. They protected us. What they were promised. Full territorial sovereignty," he said. "No kingdom claim north of the Threnfell. Ronan has the documentation already. I sent it 3 weeks ago." She was quiet for a moment. Something in her face shifted, not softening, but reconfiguring. The internal update of a woman who had been prepared for a longer argument. "All right," she said. "Lyra." He said her name the way he had not allowed himself to say it in the throne room, as an address to a full person, not a category. "I am not going to ask you to trust me. I don't think trust is a thing you build from asking. I think it's a thing that either accrues from evidence or it doesn't." He held her gaze. "I intend to spend whatever time is available producing evidence." She looked at him for a long moment. The assembly hall was emptying around them, the court dispersing to its routine. Soren, in the carrier against her chest, pulsed once. Warm and directionless, the sleeping pulse, the pulse that had stopped armies and reoriented bloodlines and brought a king to his knees in the frozen north. "Evidence," she said, not agreeing, not refusing, assessing the word. "Yes, that takes time. I know. And I will not agree to anything on a timeline that isn't mine." "I know that too," he said. "You told me the first morning. You're not building anything that depends on anyone else's permission to stand. He looked at her. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking for the right to be present while you build. The hall was nearly empty. The light through the high windows was gray and thin. Soren's hand from inside the carrier had found the edge of the table and was examining its texture with the focused impracticality of an infant determined to understand everything in his immediate vicinity. Lyra watched her son's hand for a moment. Then she looked at Kael and said, "Don't waste it. Years move the way years do when the work is real. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the specific accumulation of things that are being built rather than performed." The plague treatments, derived from the genetic mapping that Soren's bloodline made possible, took 18 months to develop and 2 years to distribute through the affected territories. Lyra ran the medical program herself, with a team she trained and a protocol she wrote and a travel schedule that put her in every clan territory north and south of the Threnfell over the course of 4 years. She was not in the Citadel often. When she was, she worked. When she wasn't, she was in the north, or in the territory clinics, or in the assembly building in the third-floor room she had claimed as a permanent workspace, and which looked, to anyone who visited it, exactly like a place where serious work was done, organized without excess, functional without apology. Soren grew. He grew the way the documentation had suggested he would grow, and also in ways that surprised everyone, including Lyra, who had the best available information and had learned to hold it loosely because Soren routinely exceeded its predictions. His wolf sense was extraordinary from his first full shift at age 3. Not brutal, not domineering, but something more specific and harder to categorize. An awareness. A capacity to hold multiple realities simultaneously without resolving them into a simpler story. He had Lyra's hands. He had Kael's eyes, the deep gray stone, though what he did with them was something neither of his parents fully recognized in themselves. A quality of looking that was simply, completely present, without the performing layer that both Lyra and Kael had developed over years of navigating worlds that weren't safe enough to be fully visible in. He learned to read from Lyra and tactics from Ronan and the history of the bloodlines from Serath, who lived long enough to finish teaching it, and then, on a quiet morning in his 91st year, simply stopped. Soren sat with him that last morning and held the old man's hand and did not try to fill the silence, which Serath, Lyra believed, would have considered the correct response. The throne changed, not in a ceremony, not in a declaration, in the accumulation of how things actually ran. Who was consulted on medical policy, who authored the territorial sovereignty agreements, whose signature appeared on the documents that restructured the bloodline registry into something transparent and accountable rather than controlled by the Elder Council. The throne became, functionally, a shared instrument, which was not what it had been built to be, and which required the steady dismantling and rebuilding of structures that had calcified over generations into the shape of dominance without function. Kael did this work the same way he had done everything after the North, directly, without the performance layer, with the specific labor of a man who had understood what he'd built wrong and was correcting it brick by brick rather than announcing a correction and expecting the bricks to comply. Lyra did not thank him for it. She had told him not to waste it, and he was not wasting it, which was not the kind of thing you thank someone for. It was the kind of thing you simply acknowledged was happening. She acknowledged it when it warranted acknowledging, with the same accuracy she brought to everything else. It was enough. On a night in the 7th year, after Soren had been put to bed and the Citadel had settled into its late-hour quiet, Lyra stood at the window of the third-floor workspace and looked out at the moonlit courtyard below. The same courtyard she had crossed years ago on the morning of the exile. The same gray stones. The same ironwood gates on the south end, currently standing open because the policy of closing the gate at nightfall had been one of the first things changed after the trial and had not been reversed. She had a report in her hands that she'd been reading for an hour. Plague recovery statistics from the Northern Territories, showing the 7th consecutive year of bloodline stabilization in the affected houses. The numbers were good. Better than good. They were, by any clinical measure, conclusive. It was over. The thing that had started the morning she walked out of those gates with cracked boots and a secret and a refusal to stop, it was over. The damage was not over because damage doesn't end. It becomes part of the structure of the person who carries it and changes what they build. But the crisis was done. The plague was done. The conspiracy was accounted for. The heir was alive and growing into something no one had quite been prepared for. She stood at the window for a long time. Kael came and stood beside her. He had developed, over 7 years, the particular skill of being in a room without filling it unnecessarily. She had watched it develop in him the way you watch a skill develop in someone who is working at it deliberately. The early mistakes giving way to competence, giving way to something that looked, finally, like a natural state rather than an acquired one. He looked at the report in her hands. The Threnfell territories, he said. The numbers. Conclusive, she said. He looked at the courtyard below. She looked at it with him. I used to think, he said, after a while, that the measure of a person was what they were capable of taking, how much weight they could carry without breaking, how much damage they could absorb and keep functioning. He paused. I built an entire kingdom on that idea. I know, she said. I was wrong, he said. I know I was wrong now, not because someone told me, but because I have watched you for 7 years, and what I have watched is not a person who endured. It's a person who chose, at every available point, what to build with what was left. He paused again. The courtyard was silver in the moonlight, the gates open, the ironwood black and solid and exactly what it had always been. A gate, not a judgment. The strength wasn't in the carrying, it was in the choosing. She looked at the open gate for a long time. Soren asked me today, she said, what I would do if I could do it differently. What did you tell him? I told him I'd have walked out faster. She let a beat pass. He didn't like that answer. What did he want you to say? That I would have stayed and fought. She looked at Kael. But I told him, the fight I had staying would have been for a place I had no standing in. The fight I had leaving was for something I could actually build. She held his gaze. You can't fight for a future from inside the structure that's trying to prevent you from having one. You go build it somewhere else, and then you bring it back when you have enough ground to stand on. Kael was quiet. She could see him taking it in, not as a lesson directed at him, though it was partly that, but as a truth she had arrived at through her own process and was sharing because it was finished. Because it was true. Did he understand? Kael said. He'll understand it in 10 years, she said. That's how it works. Outside, under the moonlit kingdom, the gates stood open. The northern territories were sovereign. The bloodlines were recovering. The heir slept in the room down the hall with his wolf sense running quietly, enormous and unperformed, already in the process of becoming something that would outlast everyone in the building. Lyra Vale had not been restored. Restoration implied a return to a prior state, and the woman who stood at this window was not the woman who had been exiled through those gates. That woman had been careful, contained, building her competence in silence and hoping the silence would be enough. This woman had walked 12 days through hostile territory and delivered her son in a pine resin cabin and put her own marrow into a dying child and stepped into a firing line with an infant on her chest and sat in an assembly hall and testified with complete accuracy against the people who had tried to erase her. She had not been restored. She had been made. By the North. By the work. By every choice she had made when the choices were bad, and she made them anyway because the alternative was to let the sentence go unfinished. She turned from the window. There was work tomorrow. There was always work tomorrow, which was not a burden but a fact, and facts were the only foundation she had ever trusted to hold weight. She put the report down on her desk and turned out the light. The moonlit kingdom stretched outside the open gate, quiet and cold and fully, permanently hers.